Baku, the glitzy capital of Azerbaijan on the Caspian Sea and co-host of the Euro 2020 football championship. Under the autocratic rule of Ilham Aliyev, human rights are literally being trampled to the ground.
کانال مستندهای پارسی.
It's quite clearly a dictatorship.
In Europe, the Aliyev regime is trying to buy itself a clean reputation with cash. Since the beginning of the year, an increasing number of politicians have connections to Azerbaijan. German politicians have long been campaigning in the regime's favour, apparently with no qualms.
I feel neither corrupted nor corrupt.
How far does the Aliyev influence extend? Were German politicians bribable? And what does this mean for the people in Azerbaijan? We're flying to Azerbaijan. After a long battle with the authorities, we're allowed to enter the country. The centre of Baku presents itself as an ultra-modern metropolis. Magnificent buildings and glass palaces dominate the scene. Money seems to be no object, as building work reaches ever higher into the sky. Most of the money comes from the oil and gas industry. The 180-metre-high flame towers are a shining example. They're meant to represent the blazing flames of the land of fire. Directly next door is President Aliyev's seat of government. Officially, it's not even permitted to film the building. A lot of things are different in Azerbaijan, especially when it comes to freedom and democratic standards. We meet with the activist and human rights lawyer Jala Bayramova. Her office isn't in one of the expensive buildings, but rather in a dilapidated back courtyard. She says it's dangerous to criticise the government. But she's still organised several demonstrations with her friend Jornara for women's rights. Jala is currently taking legal action against the regime in the European Court for Human Rights.
We are not free. I would even feel like we are the worst country in the region. Because first of all, human rights in a very bad situation. I'm thinking about like more than 100 who have done nothing, who has no political association, were tortured, were raped by policemen, were electrocuted for no reason. They were just grabbed from the streets and they were tortured in the police offices. And this case is now waiting for the decision from European Court of Human Rights.
The activists show us a video from a demonstration in Baku city centre a few weeks ago. We see how both women experienced police brutality. With an excessive use of force, the police arrest them after a few minutes. In the end, the lawyer is literally thrown into the police station.
You see the police as an entity that protects people from the criminals. But this is the vice versa in Azerbaijan, and the police is protecting the government from the people, from the protesters.
We go to Geneva, Switzerland, where we meet an Azerbaijani activist who has found safety here. Ermin Huseynov fled from Azerbaijan years ago.
کانال مستندهای پارسی.
He founded an organisation for journalists. His critical reports on the arrests back home made him a target of the regime. He recalls a situation at a student film screening about Che Guevara. After the police stormed the event, he and 25 other participants were taken to a police station.
They bring his gun and said, I will kill you. I said, you can't kill me. And he put like a gun, start to beat on my head and the back of the neck. So and after I'm shut it off and wake up after like 7 or 8 hours in the hospital.
Years later, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Ermin Huseynov had been abused by the police. The regime had to pay him €20,000 compensation. He tells us that for years he has been trying to draw attention to the dire human rights situation in Azerbaijan. Just as he did when he lived there, he continues to travel regularly to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg.
And I think it's first 3 or 4 years I've been very naive. Almost in 2012 I'm clear for something going wrong.
Strasbourg, the Palais de l'Europe. From here, the Council of Europe monitors human rights in 47 member states, not only in EU countries, but also in countries such as Russia and Azerbaijan, not exactly shining examples of democracies. What is the autocratic leader from Baku trying to do here? We come across a video of Ilham Aliyev making a show of entering the Council of Europe. In 2012, a serious suspicion arises that Azerbaijan is explicitly attempting to bribe politicians in the Council of Europe with cash and expensive gifts. Insiders turn to Gerald Knaus, who heads an independent think tank in Berlin, which regularly informs European governments on human rights. At the time, he and his colleagues were researching the situation in Azerbaijan.
That people receive money, gifts, paid holidays, were bribed with prostitutes, that all of this was possible in Strasbourg. And nobody had the feeling that they should do anything about it. That really shocked me.
Emin Husseinov says he made observations at the time which struck him as very disconcerting. He observed 2 men in the plenary room in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg.
Once I see by my own eyes how Elhan Suleymanov, he just sits on the corridor with his assistant, he's open his bag, and the list, and the envelopes, like from banks, like long envelope from banknotes. And we exactly clearly heard what they're talking about, and Elhan Suleymanov looking to the list and say for. But we already give him what he wants. Say for, no, it's some kind of new issues happen, we should give more.
Were they talking about bribes? The journalist could prove nothing. In early 2013, a memorable meeting took place in the Council of Europe. The German SPD delegate Christoph Streser introduced a resolution to the plenum which hit Azerbaijan very hard. He was demanding the release of political prisoners, but the resolution was rejected after a heated debate. At the time, Christoph Streser had spoken to countless experts and human rights activists. He was expecting some resistance, but the defeat came as a surprise to him. What surprised him more were the cheers of victory from Azerbaijani delegates.
One of the most astounding things came from the head of the Azerbaijan delegation at the time, who jumped up and exclaimed in English,
"This is not the Council of Mr. Streser, this is our Council of Europe."
The Council of Europe in Azerbaijani hands? A short while later, the Italian finance authorities came across dubious cash flows to an Italian member of the Council of Europe. Luca Volonté is alleged to have received money from Azerbaijan. With the help of an Azerbaijani envoy, the regime is alleged to have funneled more than 2 million euros to Volonté, disguised as a consultant's fee. Emails show that Volonté organised votes against the Streser resolution. According to investigators, he complained to Azerbaijani colleagues just a few days after the vote that the payment hadn't arrived. "So you have forgotten me after your victory?" At the beginning of this year, a court in Milan sentenced him to 4 years imprisonment for corruption. Volonté has lodged an appeal. Due to current proceedings, he doesn't wish to comment. German politicians are also alleged to have received money from Azerbaijan. One name in particular crops up, that of Eduard Lindner. In the 1990s, the CSU politician was a state secretary in the Ministry of the Interior under Helmut Kohl. Later, he was sent to the Council of Europe as a member of the Bundestag. After many telephone calls, the 76-year-old agrees to meet us in his private office. For the first time on camera, he talks about the allegations made against him and how he began to pursue common interests with Azerbaijani delegates.
It's quite simple. We were, of course, together in the relevant committee or panel that was dealing with it. You get talking, sure. That's a matter of course.
He maintains that his involvement with Azerbaijan served the interests of Germany.
Azerbaijan is, of course, an extremely interesting area in the world. It's on the ancient Silk Road. Then there's a lot of gas and oil, with a pipeline as far as Italy. That means that the interests of Europe, and also of Germany, in securing relationships with Azerbaijan are obvious, and worth the endeavors we undertook.
But in the meantime, Lindner is suspected of corruption. At the beginning of last year, these rooms were searched by the Public Prosecutor's Office. After his political career, Lindner founded several companies. Some of them were directly financed by organizations close to the regime in Azerbaijan. According to investigators, a sum of several million euros apparently made its way to Germany via a Danish bank and 4 London shell companies.
Apparently you received over 4 million euros in these years. What did you do with this money?
Well, it always sounds like such a huge sum of money. We got monthly contributions, and we rented and equipped an expensive office in the Berlin government quarter. We hired staff, so in the end, there wasn't so much left.
And the rest of the money? According to investigators, Lindner distributed a further part of it to other politicians. In 2017, CDU politician Karin Strenz, who died suddenly in March this year, was campaigning for the Bundestag election. Shortly before this photo op in front of a supermarket, the political magazine Report Mainz discovered that she received 22,500 euros from a consulting contract. We asked about that.
You can ask me for an interview after the Bundestag election. Then we will meet in our office, God willing, and we can talk there.
You worked with Mr. Lindner for a firm of Mr. Lindner's as an advisor, is that right? What did you receive the money for? The question is simply about the service you rendered for this money from Mr. Lindner.
Did she receive money for favors for the regime in Azerbaijan?
کانال مستندهای پارسی.
We notice how intensively she was nurturing relationships with Azerbaijan at the time. These images show her on a trip with a Bundestag delegation to Baku in 2015. She seems to get along very well with autocrat Ilham Aliyev. In the Council of Europe, she even votes against the release of political prisoners in Azerbaijan. Furthermore, she travels to the country as an election observer, certifying the clean elections of the Aliyev regime.
From what I've seen today, this was a proper election. There are no criticisms to be made regarding international standards.
How could Karin Strenz make this statement? Our further research shows that election observers from the OSCE, Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, came to a completely different conclusion. According to them, the elections were neither free nor democratic. Strenz's election observation was organised privately by Eduard Lindner. In the interview, we are surprised how openly he acknowledges that everything, flights, accommodation, expenses, was paid for at the time by the Aliyev regime.
The people who invite you to observe clearly hope to have a more convincing, a more objective picture, if you like, when there are several observers present, and not just one. We observed, and we did not detect any serious breaches of the democratic rules in the polling stations on election day.
As a member of the Council of Europe, SPD Human Rights Commissioner Frank Schwaber was also an election observer in Azerbaijan as part of an official mission. What does he say about the private election observations organised by Eduard Lindner?
It is absolutely clear that Azerbaijan buys election observation missions to portray a positive picture internationally and to create the opposite impression of what is actually happening in the country. They make use of European politicians, also members of the German Bundestag, and I think that is the most corrupt thing you can possibly do.
In the meantime, the Council of Europe commissioned an external inquiry into allegations of corruption among delegates. The inquiry found that the delegates involved were guilty of serious breaches. This resulted in a ban for Eduard Lindner and Karen Strenz. German investigating authorities now have their sights set on another politician, the CDU member of the German Bundestag, Axel E. Fischer. For several years, he was head of the German delegation in the Council of Europe. Azerbaijani journalist Amin Huseynov met Fischer several times in the Council of Europe. He says he mostly experienced the CDU politician as someone who hindered any clarification of the events.
I am told to Mr. Fischer dozens of times, for we want to give them testimony because many people from their group, from EPP, they are affiliated with some dirty interests. They work like without any kind of shame as like lobbyists for Azerbaijani government and the Council of Europe. And he's always staying on their side.
Axel E. Fischer has been to Azerbaijan many times too, and is also suspected of receiving money from Eduard Lindner.
Did Fischer receive money from you?
I have no idea. I really can't tell you. The files would have to be checked. It's so long ago, and there were so many cooperations. Whether money was paid for any kind of activities, I can't tell you off the top of my head, much as I would like to.
Axel Fischer was one of the chief protagonists in this Council of Europe world. The idea that it has slipped Mr. Lindner's mind as to whether Axel Fischer got a share of the cash
کانال مستندهای پارسی
is not very credible.
In the meantime, the Bundestag has lifted the CDU politician's immunity. He's being investigated on allegations of corruption. We sent a written request for an interview, but Fischer refuses. He doesn't respond to our list of questions either. Until the beginning of 2018, Axel E. Fischer sat here, in seat 194 in the Council of Europe. For years, he and other German politicians are alleged to have acted in Azerbaijan's interests. Ilham Aliyev used decisions in the Council of Europe to portray himself in a favourable light, like in 2014, when he was asked by a journalist about political prisoners in Azerbaijan.
Last December, there was a broad discussion in the Council of Europe about this issue, and the resolution which was launched by some members of the Assembly with respect to the issue of political prisoners in Azerbaijan failed. The majority of the Assembly did not support that resolution, and actually that means that what I said last time here in the European Commission, that there are no political prisoners in Azerbaijan.
In the heart of Germany, we meet Yafaz Hazanov, a man for whom such words sound like a mockery. In his home country, he worked as a correspondent for an American radio station. When he did some research into torture in Azerbaijani prisons, he was kidnapped on the street by armed Secret Service agents and deported to neighbouring Iran.
They deported me to Iran, and they thought I would be arrested and executed by the Iranian Secret Service.
He tells us how he only managed to escape by using his wits. Because of his research, the Secret Service kept threatening and beating him. In 2014, a Facebook group even put a bounty on his head. He remembers their exact words.
This group is against the journalist Yafaz Hassanov. He is a traitor. He writes against our state and our government. And he has to be killed. We are looking for an assassin to kill him.
Hazanov fled the country. He has now found asylum in Germany. He's disappointed that in particular German politicians support the Aliyev regime.
We wanted an Azerbaijan like Germany, but the Azerbaijani government has made Germany like Azerbaijan. Corrupt politicians.
Corrupt politicians? It's clear to us that not everyone who speaks to representatives of the Azerbaijani regime is automatically corrupt. But politicians with especially close ties to the country are the most conspicuous. Mark Hauptmann, one of the CDU politicians who resigned over the so-called face mask scandal, had a constituency newspaper financed by Azerbaijan, one with advertising copy about shopping in Baku. He did not answer our questions. Egon Juttner is a former CDU member of the German Bundestag from Baden-Württemberg. According to our research, he travelled to Baku for private election observation on Eduard Lindner's invitation. He tells us that he received no money from Azerbaijan. Years ago, Nicholas Löbel wanted to have a CDU event sponsored by an Azerbaijani lobby organisation. He later travelled several times to Baku. He didn't react to our questions. We learned that he celebrated his birthday in the expensive Hotel Adlon with the Azerbaijani ambassador.
کانال مستندهای پارسی.
Is there an Azerbaijan network among parliamentarians in Berlin? We stumble upon a remarkable incident in the Bundestag. In 2019, 4 members of the Bundestag submitted a parliamentary question regarding the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan and Armenia have fought over the region for decades. The Azerbaijani autocrat Aliyev accuses Armenia of illegally occupying Nagorno-Karabakh. The CDU members of the Bundestag, Olav Gutting, Eberhard Ginger and Nicholas Löbel, want to know whether the German government shares Azerbaijan's position. Axel E. Fischer, too, is one of the politicians with this question. What is strange is that all 4 questions have exactly the same wording. How is this possible? Was there an agreement? Our research shows that the idea for the question came directly from here, the Azerbaijani embassy. An email to a member of the Bundestag in September 2019 said, "We would be very pleased if you could follow up on this matter."
Under international law, the position is clear. Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan, but there are also international negotiations with the involvement of the Federal Republic of Germany. And of course, these members of the Bundestag have undermined these negotiations and rather given Azerbaijan the feeling that if they are hostile there might be international cover for them.
The fact is, 1 year later, in the summer of 2020, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh did escalate. Azerbaijan conquered a large part of the territory. There were many casualties. As a symbol of victory, an installation was erected in the city centre. Helmets of fallen Armenian soldiers were displayed, as were tanks with grotesque depictions of conquered Armenians. This in a country which is a member of the Council of Europe and has committed to observing human rights. The authoritarian ruler Aliyev seems to be sitting even more comfortably. A large sign at the installation reads, "Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan," with the name of the president underneath. Aliyev secures his power as before, chiefly with the sale of oil and gas. In our research, we see row upon row of oil production facilities outside the gates of Baku. The air stinks of oil. The ground seems to be contaminated for miles. But oil and gas from Azerbaijan are sought after in Europe. Since the beginning of the year, Azerbaijan gas is transported through a new 3,000-kilometre-long pipeline as far as Italy. From there, it flows into the European grid, also to Germany. He is one of the leading figures in Azerbaijan's energy sector, Elmar Mammadov, director of the German office of the powerful energy group SOCAR. The German Azerbaijani Forum, or DAF, is part of his network in Germany. Its honorary chairman is Otto Hauser, who is also honorary consul to Azerbaijan. A former government spokesman of Helmut Kohl, he has always publicly praised the Azerbaijani regime. Thomas Barreis, Parliamentary State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, was also a long-standing member of the DAF. He's often travelled to Azerbaijan with Eduard Lindner and Otto Hauser. On a trip in 2019, Hauser, honorary consul to Azerbaijan, did not sit next to President Aliyev, but rather with the German delegation at the side of Barreis.
کانال مستندهای پارسی
You can see from this photo that there was a kind of familiarity, where everyone who was involved knew each other well, and everyone did something to influence German foreign and economic policy in Azerbaijan's favor. That is absolutely out of order.
Thomas Barreis sends a message via the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy that he had no influence in the meeting procedures in Baku. Our research shows a web of German politicians who have campaigned for the interest of Azerbaijan. Some show a strange lack of distance, others are politically proactive in the regime's interest. And others are now confronted with criminal investigations because they allowed themselves to be bribed. We sent questions regarding these incidents to the Azerbaijani embassy in Berlin, but have received no answers. What about German politics? The now deceased Karin Strenz was reprimanded by the Bundestag but was allowed to keep her seat until the end, just like parliamentarian Axel E. Fischer. Nikolaus Löbel and Mark Hauptmann have both lost their seats, not due to the Azerbaijan affair, but due to dubious face mask deals during the COVID-19 pandemic. Strasbourg, early April. Chancellor Angela Merkel has joined the Council of Europe by video call. She makes a statement regarding the Azerbaijan affair.
We've looked into the matter very comprehensively, and one has to say that everyone involved in this Azerbaijan matter has, in my view, been subject to very critical discussions in public. I think that the transparency of the Council of Europe, as well as our debriefing on a national level, have led to the prevention of such a case in the future.
Convincing words from a head of government? Gerhard Knaus, whose initial research into corruption in the Council of Europe mostly fell on deaf ears at first, has a clear demand.
Germany ought to ensure that a new inquiry into the matter is commissioned. What role did the Azerbaijan regime play in this affair? And what has happened so far in the member states? If Germany campaigned for that, it would be a clear signal that people are taking this scandal seriously.
The regime critic and Swiss exile Ermin Huseynov is disappointed by Germany. While German politicians have been aiding and abetting the Aliyev regime, human rights abuses are continuing in Azerbaijan until today.
They're still our future, our hopes for the future. And today Germany didn't do anything.
Lobbyist Eduard Lindner, who has received millions of euros from Azerbaijan, sees no problem with it.
What we did there was neither illegal nor in any way objectionable.
So your conscience is clear?
Yes, certainly.
کانال مستندهای پارسی